start and finish Siman Kuf Chav Daled today. I'm going to go through a few Sifim which are relevant, and the Kudas Shonageh Lamaisa in Hilchis Gitin Siman Kuf Chav Daled, which was learned a week ago, last week, not this week. Kuf Yutes deals with when a person should get divorced, how to determine the wife's sanity, etc. We didn't learn it. Kuf Chav through Kuf Chav Gimel deals with making sure the husband is sane, and all the appointment of the sefer, etc. All the things that are relevant to the halachas before you start writing the get. And we did discuss a bunch of topics that are relevant to the actual writing of the get, but not in an orderly fashion. And Kuf Chav Daled begins with the seder of actually writing the get. The first thing that's going to be discussed is what you could write the get on. The Tur opens by saying you could write the get on anything which is tolush, which is not connected to the ground, even if it is Isurei Hano. That means l'chatchila you could write even on something which is Isurei Hano. The Shulchan Aruch says, the way the Shulchan Aruch begins is, if you wrote on Isurei Hano, it's kosher. It doesn't mention the din of tolush. Yeah, the Bach explains why does the Tur specify it in such a way, present the halacha in such a way that you could write on anything which is tolush, and even if it's Isurei Hano, to tell you that just like from the Gemara, even though from the Gemara it's mashma that writing on Isurei Hano is only kosher b'diavad, the halacha, just like writing l'chatchila betolush, that's a halacha that you have to. Writing on Isurei Hano is kosher l'chatchila. But from Lashon Mechaber that says get shekosvu al Isurei Hano, a get which was already written in Isurei Hano, it's mashma that it's only a din of b'diavad. But l'chatchila, you should not be writing on something which is a Isurei Hano, and if you look at it, that's how the Beis Shmuel and the Taz both understand the Mechaber. The Ramah adds on to this as follows, that if it's talking about something which is Isurei Hano, which is oimedli sarif, which is intended to be burnt, the get is batal. This is based on the Ran. Why? Because kol oimedli sarif kesarif dam is something which is meant to be burnt. If it's burnt, therefore the get is as if it's sneeze. It's non-existent. It's non-existent at all. Now, so is this Isurei Hano, writing on Isurei Hano, not about something which has to be burnt, but writing on Isurei Hano something which is, do we paskin as l'chatchila, do we paskin as b'diavad? If you look in the Pri Chodosh, same thing is also in the Get Pashut, in Sifkot and Aleph, that it's obvious that the halacha is that it's kosher only b'diavad. And the Pri Chodosh says that the Bach says that the Tur had a logic behind it, that being that you're not being nehene from the get, but you're only using it for writing a get, therefore it should be kosher l'chatchila. He says it's not understood, especially since it's mashma from Taisvus that there's a psa shayla ve'isur derabanan over there, and therefore the Pri Chodosh concludes that the ikar is like the Mechaber. If you look in the Bar Heitev and in the Gra, they both point out that according to the Rambam and to the Tur, you write on Isurei Hano l'chatchila. It's mashma, the Bar Heitev takes it lahalacha that you, and the Gra takes it lahalacha that you could write on Isurei Hano l'chatchila. Now, so what is something which is asur b'hano, but it's not oimedli sarif? So the Get Pashut takes something which all of us know, or at least we think we know, this klal, that something which is avodah zarah, which belongs to a yid, cannot be nizbatel, and it has to be burnt because it's avodah zarah, and therefore that's an example of something you cannot write a get on. And if it's paper of avodah zarah of a goy, since the goy could be mevatel the avodah zarah from it, so it's not oimedli sarif, so you could write a get on it. That's one of the examples that he brings. Just if you want to see more examples, you look in the Get Pashut, you'll be able to see More examples of Sifkaten Beis. Now, on this ran that the Ramah brings, that if it's omidli sarif, kesarif dami, and therefore the get is bottle, you look in the Chalkas Mechayik, the Chalkas Mechayik asks questions on the ran. Seems like it's not comfortable with saying that it's mamash, the get is completely bottle. Chalkas Mechayik also is makshan the Bach, that says that lechatchil it's muter in general with Isuri Ano, and he says, because the Bach says that the whole reason is because you're not planning on being nana from the get. He says, well, if you have a ishara, you're nana from, it's a mitzvah for you to give a get, you're nana from giving the get. So what do you mean there's no hana over there? And Bechlal regarding this, now just to go into a little bit, we're going to go a little bit more into this whole Oimedli Sarif. If you look in the Pri Chodesh writes at length about it. I'm not going to go into it now. But his maskana is that it's not like we don't pass like the Ramah, but even something which is Oimedli Sarif, the get is still kosher. It's no different than any other form of Isurei Hana. Why? Because he takes the approach that Kol Oimedli Sarif is not Kesaruf Dami. Pri Chodesh. He's mevared. It's a machlokes if kol oimedli sarif kesarif dami. It's a machlokes if paper of Isurei Hana, if paper of Edazar is taka oimedli sarif. There's a bunch of machlokes over there regarding this, and he discusses them. Tzemach Tzedek also discusses them, which we're going to get to soon. Tzemach Tzedek you already know from last year if you were here last year. Teras Gitin comes with a very interesting distinction, an explanation to this whole thing of Isurei Hana, and he says, what are we talking about that it's asur to write on Isurei Hana? Not asur, but l'chatchila you shouldn't write on Isurei Hana the mashmos of the mechaber. He's talking about the husband. If the husband is giving a get, and he's the one who's having hana, even though mitzvahs left no honest nitnu, but he's the one who's having hana, so that person is the one who should not be writing a get on Isurei Hana. But if a sofer is writing the get, and it's a mokim igun, and he's writing it for free, and it was a kisfu tenu, so then it's a mitzvah, and he's obviously not having any hana, so therefore in such a case, l'chatchila he could even write on something which is Isurei Hana. I don't know if you even came across it, but years ago, and even hundreds of years ago, when you would buy paper, it would have a watermark of the company which produced the paper. In certain countries, the Get Pashat mentions it in the end of Sifkaten Beis, one of the watermarks in the back of the paper was a cross. Yeah, everything had crosses then. Even you bought a box of tea, it had a cross in it. You bought everything, it had crosses on it. The symbols of the country where it was a cross in a lot of places. So if you have paper which has a cross on it, it's not visible, but there's a mark of a cross on it. Either if it's a watermark or it's engraved into it. So he says, l'chatchila, it's not roi to write a get on it. It doesn't say that it's asur, so it's not roi. Teras Gitin in Biurim Sifkaten Aleph brings this get pashat and says that lav dafke that it's asur to write on such a piece of paper because the guy was the one who printed it, and the guy then sold the paper to the Jew, and even if the guy had in mind of avodah zareh, the moment he sold it to the Jew, it was already invatal avodah zareh, and therefore there's no more avodah zareh in it. But still,
Selling it to the Jew.
He says he had in mind to be invatal avodah zareh by selling it, which is not such a clear explanation. But regardless, the get pasha doesn't say it's asur and doesn't say it's Isurei Hana. He just says ein roi. It's not fit. It's not something you should do. And I think that the uncomfortability of somebody receiving a get or writing a get on such a thing will still remain. The Tzemach Tzedek, which we discussed in the past, it's over there. The question is, well, a person divorced his wife. A few months later, he was moitzi laz at the paper in which he wrote the get. Even o Ezer Siman Kuf Samach Gimel. It's about a man who was megadish his wife, and after a few months he was moitzi laz the paper on which he wrote the get. He was able to get a certain mumur in town to be mishtachvet to the piece of paper, and therefore the paper is isurei hano, which is dinei b'sreifa, and the get is not kosher. And the husband, the chacham says, and this is 8 months after the get, and that's why when I wrote the get, when I came to write the get, I made sure that the sofer should not give me paper as a present, but I dafke wanted the paper that I brought along with me. Now, the discussion of this tzemach tzedek we already discussed last year, because it has to do with a lechi, that there's a discussion about a lechi that's made from Asherah, from Isurei Hano, and the tzemach tzedek discusses, this is the tshuva where the tzemach tzedek discusses it in passing, which we discussed last year. One of the things tzemach tzedek points out over there is that in the research that was discussed over there, the city doesn't have any mumarim, they found out, and there's no mumarim in the area. Just sometimes an interesting point to know of the story that happened. And as the tzemach tzedek goes, the first page is just a discussion on the difference between avodah zarah of a yid, avodah zarah of a goy. When does it need sreifa? When does it not need sreifa, but it needs gnizah? Maybe a paper of a yid, avodah zarah of a yid only needs gnizah and not sreifa. There's a machlokes rishonim. Could be that avodah zarah of a yid is less strict than avodah zarah of a goy. Yes, you cannot be mevatel it, but it does not need sreifa. It only needs gnizah. Bichlal is a machlokes of kol ha'omed l'sarav k'sarav dami, and he says over there something which doesn't need a specific shear, just like that's where the lechi comes in. Something which a chacham were not kevei a specific shear in it. So even if we say kol ha'omed l'sarav k'sarav dami, if you would burn it and it would become into ashes, it doesn't need a specific shear, so therefore it will still be kosher. So just like by a lechi would be kosher, it says the get also doesn't say anywhere in Shulchan Aruch that the get has to have a shear. If somebody would be able to write a get on a beautiful tiny ksav and write it on a little square, on a little post-it note, there's no isser. It doesn't say anywhere that the get has a specific shear, how many tfachim it has to be. And therefore, he says, even if it's avodah zarah of a yid, it would be kosher. And bifrat, if it's a suffix avodah zarah of a yid. And we have a bunch of sfeikos over here. From the tzemach tzedek, it's mashma that he's machriya that we do say kolas oimed lisarav kesarav dami. Elamai, in this case, we have a suffix if it's oimed l'sreifa. Why is there a suffix if it's oimed l'sreifa? Before we go into the details of the story, because lav davka that a paper of avodah zarah of a yid is considered oimed l'sreifa. Maybe it's oimed l'gniza. So once there's a suffix, if it's oimed l'sreifa, then even those that say that kol ha'omed l'sreifa kesarav dami over here, they're not going to say that it's kesarav dami. And for sure, those that hold that by Yisrael it does not have to be burnt, it only needs gniza, for sure, it's not kesarav dami. And therefore, he says, so we have a suffix. He says, and even if you're going to want to be machmir in a suffix, still no, over here it's not a suffix, because of that the husband is bechlal not trusted. First of all, because right now the paper is not in his hands now, so he can't poisel something which is not in his hands. He wasn't me'arer right away at the time of the get. He's not ne'eman to be oiser something which already has a cheskas heter. There's no raglaim l'davar that he's bechlal ne'eman v'adarabe punkt verkehrt. There's no mummer in the area. If you want to say raglaim l'davar, we have a umdun of farket that all he wants to do is he just wants to bother her. He wants to get a couple dollars out of her, rubles in those days. And the main thing that tzemach tzedek says is that it's a davar that it's considered a davar shebe'erva to be mevatel a get kosher, which is becheskas kosher, that was already given to a woman who's for long enough she was already muchzak like a gerusha in bezdin. And since that amount of time passed, he's for sure not ne'eman. And he says, derech agav, he's not ne'eman to say when she was muchzak as a grusha, even if she didn't remarry yet. He can't be ma'arer on the get anymore. And at the end of the tshuva, there's over there a summary of the tshuva, like a extra piece at the end of it. The Tzemach Tzedek says that even he's not Ne'eman because he doesn't have any Eidim on it. And the fact, even though you have a svara to say that maybe he has a raya, he has a proof that he was action zich dafka to use his paper, so maybe that's a proof that he was trying to pull a trick on. So that's still not enough of a raya. Why? Because ein adam meisim atzmei rasha. What is he saying by saying this? He's saying, I have my own paper. I went and found the mummer. And I told the mummer to bow down to this piece of paper and have in mind Avodah Zarah. That's already meisim atzmei rasha, that he went and he convinced somebody a yid to do an aveda. However, what's interesting is that Tzemach Tzedek in this tshuva doesn't discuss too much the shitta of the Pri Chadash that there's no difference between Kol Ha'omed L'Yisaref, between Davar Ha'omed L'Yisaref and Shari Surya. And even when he does mention it, he doesn't mention it as an independent sniff. That means when you need to deal with a heter, you bring different sniffim. It doesn't bring as an independent sniff, rather it's brought as a sniff to already an existing sniff. He connects it to one of the sniffim that he brings. So it seems like that Tzemach Tzedek did not really accept this svara that something which is oimed l'sreifa is completely the same as Shari Surya like a Pri Chadash. Even though Tzemach Tzedek quotes a Pri Chadash a lot. Since we're talking about a Surya now, it's a very interesting tshuva from the Minchas Shlomo from Shem Zalman Auerbach in Chelek Aleph, Siman Nun Aleph, Ois Yud Gimel. This is a Chelek Aleph from Minchas Shlomo, Siman Nun Aleph. There's a whole list of questions in Dinei Shmita. And he has 25 different sections in this. It's all in one Siman. In Ois Yud Gimel, he goes into a discussion if you could write a Sefer Torah from ink of Shmita. He says, the Chayra, it's also to write. He says, but if you look in the Pirush of Arash Sirlio on Yerushalmi, in Masechah Shvius, it's mashma that it's mutter. Then he goes into a discussion, what happens if you wrote, according to the Ran that says, it Kosav Isuri Ano Shadinei Besreifa. Yeah, that it's Kol Ha'omed L'Yisaref Kesar of Dami, and Shemitah fruits that were done wrong, that were picked, they're supposed to be nisraf. So therefore, if you wrote a get with ink, that is Shemitah ink, that is Asur, would the get be possible or not? Because he starts with the Sefer Torah and he moves into the get. And he says, well, first of all, the ink before it's written on paper is liquid. Liquid you don't burn. Liquid, it says you're supposed to bury it. Liquid of Shemitah. But once it dries, maybe you are supposed to burn it. Because now it's dry, it could be burnt. And the Minchas Shlomo comes with a very interesting chiddush. He says, this Kol Ha'omed L'Yisaref doesn't apply to ink, it applies to the paper. Why is that? Because if you're going to burn the paper, if the paper is Isuri Ano, the Ha'omed L'Yisaref, and the ink is kosher ink, so if you're going to burn the paper, what's going to happen? The letters are going to be Oisies Poichas. They're going to be flying. So you don't have a paper on what the get should rest. But if the paper is kosher paper, and the only problem is that you have is ink that is a Suryano, burnt ink is still black, still ink. And therefore, Lu Yitzur, you would burn the paper, you would burn the ink without burning the paper, dry ink, you would still be able, because Lu Yitzur, there would be a way to burn just the ink on top of the paper. It was black, stayed black, and the letters are still visible because the paper didn't burn. If you have paper that doesn't burn, you would just be able to light the ink on fire. So therefore, if you wrote with ink, which is a Suryana, it says it's mutter. It's only when it comes to paper. He says maybe, but Lamaisi, he says after the get is already given everything, maybe Yishtaka should burn the get to take care of this problem of Shvius, of Biur Shvius, but he doesn't say that. But Lamaisi, he says that Dioy of Suryana is fine. That is regarding Seif Aleph. Move to Seif Beis. Sif Beis, it says you could write a get on anything which is yachal, even something which is yachal is dayef, something which could be forged, as long as you give it with Eidei Mesirah. Now I just want to point out, when I'm going through this shir and this siman, I'm not going through every detail of I'm just focusing on specific topics which I think are relevant today also. Half of it is not relevant today, or I never saw anybody writing a get by tattooing it on the hand of an Evet, so I'm not going to get into that discussion. even get davar sheyachal is daif. It's also not such a common thing, except for one element, which I'm going to discuss towards the end. Yeah, but over there it says, if you write a get on davar sheyachal is daif, and being that yachal is daif, it's not enough to just rely on the eidech simeh, you have to do eideh mesireh, which could confirm that this is exactly the get that was given. The Rama brings over there that you could write on anything which is talush, and we know that from the Mechaber, even if it's not bar kayama, even if it's not something which is good, davar shekayama, if it's not something which is going to last eternally. Right? If it's not talush, we have the problem that we discussed already. Even mechuber is discussed in the Siman, where we discussed it in the past. Something which is mechuber, you have a problem because that's because of an asan. If you have a hefsek between the cause of an asan, then the get is pasul or batul, depending on how you understand it. Yeah, and the Rama also says that yesh oimrim, that you cannot write on something which doesn't have a long lifespan, something which is not davar shekayama. For example, it says the examples that are brought over there are onion leaves, which are not going to last too long. Then the get is considered, according to the Siyam, the get is considered pasul. The Pri Chadash over here says it's not pasul mid'Rabbanan, it's actually batul mid'Oraisa. Why? Because mid'Oraisa, ksiva, what's the definition of ksiva mid'Oraisa? We know it from Hilchos Shabbos. It has to be something which is miskayim on something which is miskayim. So the definition of ksiva, the geder of ksiva, is miskayim on miskayim. So therefore, if you don't have the ksiva, you don't have the v'kasav, even though that's not possible, it's mamash batul. The Get Pashut in Sifkoten Tes says that it's a machlekes rishonim. According to the Rif Rambam and Rosh, you could write on something which is eina miskayim. According to the Teis Ran and Rabbeinu Yerucham, has to be davar miskayim. Therefore, she is safek megureshes. He doesn't say batul. He doesn't say pasul. He says safek megureshes. Based on that, since we're discussing something which is made like a leaf of onion, which is made to fade away, if somebody writes on these modern eco papers that if you leave them outside and it gets humid, it dissolves, maybe it will be pasul. According to Rama, maybe bottle. Eco papers are papers made from like banana leaves and like fibers, cornstarch, edible paper, essentially. Or bottle, according to Pri Chadash. However, a very interesting thing is the Shas Tshuvas Maharash angle, Chelik Vav Siman Chaf Aleph, that if it's something which is not miskayim, but it could be preserved in such a way that it will become miskayim, then it's fine. So accordingly, if you have these papers which will fade in with humidity, for example, you keep them in a dry, cold place, it's not going to fade, so it will still be kosher. But if you're going to put an onion leaf, it's not going to keep even if you preserve it. The Rama continues that l'chatchila you should write a get on klaf, which is fixed and prepared like for a Sefer Torah. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that you have to do l'shem get, that you have to shech the animal like you do l'shma by a Sefer Torah, that it has to be ibud. The ibud of the klaf also has to be l'shma. But it just has to be like the klaf that used for a Sefer Torah, which means properly prepared to be able to write. Zachalkas Mechayik says right away. But it's not ma'akev. And the Rama says, and if you wrote on paper, it's kosher. And it's mashma that klaf is better than paper. And that it's a chiddush that you're allowed to write on paper. And the Chalkas Mechayik says, I don't even begin to understand the half a minute that paper is even a problem, but you have to say that that if you wrote on paper, it's fine. It's like a big chiddush of the Rama. I don't understand what the chiddush is. You could write on the Olah Shel Zayis, you could write on other things, so suddenly paper is going to be a problem. He doesn't give it, the Chelek doesn't give an answer. But if you look in Beis Meir on Even Ezer, he does give an answer. He gives a very interesting answer. And he says, what was the Hava Mina that maybe paper is a problem? How was olden day paper made? It was made, you take shmatas, you soak them, and you process them, and then all the shmatas together become a piece of paper. And we have a halacha in Siman Kuf Lamed Sif Zayin, that if you sewed or you glued together pieces of cloth and you wrote on it a get, that Ramav there says that it's suffic if it's possible. So therefore, now that you know that Ramav in Kuf Lamed, now you look at paper is made from pieces of shmata, so you understand that Ramav is telling you a chiddush. A paper is kosher for writing a get. If you look at the Pri Chadash brings from the Ma'aram Lublin that what?
If you take a paper, a bunch of different papers and stick them together, it's possible?
That's a Kuf Lamed, yeah. Safek possible. The Pri Chadash brings to the Ma'aram Lublin that the Ma'aram Lublin was shocked that somebody wrote a get on paper when in Krakow they wrote a get on cloth. But the Pri Chadash says, I don't understand. In Yerushalayim, the minhag is to write on paper. The Bach says that in other cities they also wrote on paper. There's a bunch of records that it was written on paper. The Taz comes even more and says, yes, Taka Amol in Ukraine and in Belarus they would write on cloth. But because of the Gzeiris, you couldn't always find cloth, so they started writing on paper. And he says, paper is much better than cloth. Because a cloth, you could scrape it, and you could change things, and it will be hard to tell, because it will be hard to tell if you actually scraped. You could scrape and then change things. By paper, you can't get away with these things. If you start erasing and scraping, you'll be able to tell that something that it was manipulated and it was changed. So therefore, he says, Adarab, it's even better to use paper than to use cloth. And the Get Pashat brings this Taz Lahalacha, and he also brings the Bach that the minhag already in Salonika and in Egypt was to dafka write on paper, and it seems like and today nobody writes on cloth anymore. Siv Gimel. The Mechaber says that it's better, it's good to cut the paper to the measurement that you need, so that way you should not have to cut it after you finish writing. And this is better too. Yeah, why? Because if you're going to write if you're going to have to cut it after, you come to Shilas. What's the Shilas? The Rama points out over there. If you wrote on a big piece of paper and then you cut it, it's possible. But if you cut a little bit from it just to make it look nice at the edges, probably it's not considered that. It's not a problem. Now, what's the problem? Because we mentioned before, if there's a hefsek between the kosav and venosan, you have a problem. So over here, if you're going to have to cut it before giving it, you made a hefsek between ksiva and a sinna, you have a problem. Hefsek doesn't mean a hefsek like in brachas. It means that there's an extra action needed between the two within the actual get. And what's the shear that the Ramah gives? He says that as long as you don't cut more than the amount that you wrote for the get, so let's say the get was written on this size and you're cutting it less than that, then it's fine. Tzemach Tzedek has a whole different explanation on this, which we're going to get to soon. He takes the Ramah to a little bit more extreme and more mekel, but we're going to get to it soon. But he says, L'chatchila, you should cut whatever you have to cut before writing, and even more so before sirtut, before you start making the lines. Why is that? Because sirtut is part of ksiva. And from this is what we know today, that just like ksiva has to be lishma, if you ever went to a get, you're going to hear that the sirtut is also done lishma. The Chalkas Mechayikin says, obviously the Mechaber is not telling you that and Mechaber is not telling you that you're not allowed to write in the big cloth, and you have to cut it, but rather that it's better, so that way you're not going to have any thoughts afterwards to cut it, and you're going to get yourself into problems. And if you cut it afterwards, so even though the Ramah says it's pasul, the Lashon of Ramah says it's pasul, the Chelkas Mechaykik and Sifkat Meches says it might be batal midiraisa. The base Shmuel Bechal Paskin says it's batal midiraisa. The Machlokes if Mechusar Ktzitza, if it's batal or not. The only one says pasul is the Ramah. But it's either kosher or batal, not in the middle. So it's interesting that the Ramah chose the pasul in the middle. And the Pri Chadash also takes the halacha that it's batal min ha-Torah. If you want to understand the whole machlokes, it's all in get pashat and sifkat and tazayin. There's machlokes rishonim of something which is not gedulei, which is not mechuber lekarka. Do we say mechusar ktzitza that you're going to have to cut it afterwards or not? You have Rashbam and his team, which they hold that it's kosher, being that you're not, that ktzitza is only cutting something from its source of life. And according to Rabbeinu Tam, even davar atalosh, you still have the isser of ktzitza and it's completely aser. And therefore the get pashat, following his approach, when his machlokes rishonim, we don't say one way or the other, safek megurashes. Then he brings the Bach. The Bach has an interesting, brings the Svara, the Ran brings the Svara of Haigon, and the Bach also goes with that approach, that when does this apply? It applies when you had in mind before to do it. When you started writing, you had in mind that you're going to cut afterwards. But if you didn't have in mind milchatchila to write, to cut, and then afterwards you decided to cut it, the Bach says it's kosher b'diavad. Yeah, the Ran doesn't, the Rav Hai Gaon doesn't say that half, and the get pashat says he doesn't understand the svare that it's kosher b'diavad. Mimanov shach, if you're going to follow the Rashbam, it's kosher even if you the Rashbam and his team, it's kosher even if you had in mind to cut it, because it's not a problem of talosh. And if you're going to follow Rabbeinu Tam, it's possible even if you don't have in mind to cut it, it doesn't make a difference. The only thing is, according to Rabbeinu Tam, if you cut a little bit, it is considered mutter. But then the Get Pashat says, hey, but according to Rav Hai Gaon, the Rav Hai Gaon holds that it only depends on machshava. So if you had in mind to cut it before, your machshava just made it, that there's a ktzitza involved over here between the ksiv and the sineh. So now, who cares if it's like, if you're cutting it liapaisoi, you're cutting a little bit to make it nice, or you're cutting it because you want to use the other half of the piece of paper. It should be aser even a little bit. And from the halachas g'deilos, it's mashma the same thing. And the Rashba brings the halachas g'deilos, says that according to the halachas g'deilos, it might be a safek deiraisa. So therefore, he says that if you thought milchatchila to cut a little bit afterwards to make it liapoisoi, not to use the paper but just to cut the edges, even that it's a suffix, it's aser. The only time it would be mutter, he says, if you didn't have in mind liapoisoi bichlal, you didn't have in mind to cut anything, and afterwards you realized and you decided you want to cut a little bit liapoisoi, because then you have a sfek sveika, two sveikas, and both of them are safek deraises, and therefore you could be matir. In Sifkat and Yudzayin, the Get Pasha continues again with more chumras over here. It doesn't make a difference if the Sefer was the one who had in mind that he wants to cut a piece of it off afterwards, or if the husband is the one who had in mind to cut a piece of it afterwards. As long as one of these two had in mind to cut a little bit of it afterwards, you have to be machmer. And he says, even though according to those who hold that the Sefer is not shliach habal, but only l'shma, why should his machshava make a difference? And you could be matir. Still, no. He says no. Regardless of who thought, you should be machmir. The Pischei Teshuva brings this get pashat, and he brings the get mekusher that brings the get pashat and asks a question, says a chumrah without any basis, and therefore the get mekusher takes the approach that if you didn't have in mind to cut beforehand, then even the chatchila you're allowed to cut afterwards liapoisei. Not like the Ramo says that even the chatchila you shouldn't do it, but he says, but if you had in mind the chatchila not to cut it, if you had in mind the chatchila to cut it, then you should be machmer. Now I'm going to get to the Tzemach Tzedek, which I told you that Tzemach Tzedek takes the Ramo and over here explains the Ramo differently. The There's a long tshuva Tzemach Tzedek Siman Reish Samach Zayin, which I forgot to put in the white book. There's a get b'mokim igun of a mumar, which was written with a minui, b'chsav, all the kulas together, and the people who wrote it were not mumchim, and there was like 6 or 7 shilas on the get. One of the shilas that Tzemach Tzedek deals with is the size of the paper. This is in the middle of the tshuva, in Dibur HaMaschil Me'ato Osim Dvorai, in Siman Reish Samach Zayin. Now, this is an introduction. In the olden days, the way they would print Sforim, there was something called boigans. It was big sheets of paper, and then you would cut the papers to size. So if you made a shas, it would be the big shasin would be, each one would be a half a boigan, each page. If you make a small siddur, you could fit an eighth of a boigan. There was fertile, there was half, quarter, half, and even eighth in for some small things. This get was written on a sheet which is a chatzi boigan, a half a boigan, which is pretty big. It's like an old Gemara, like a Amud of Gemara, the old ones, big piece of paper. And there's a chashash, since we're dealing with a bunch of Amaratzim who dealt with the get, maybe they had a big boigan and they cut it in half after the get. So he says, the Machzedek says, there's not a chashash b'di'evet. Why? Because the Ramos says, if you don't cut har b'yoser from the amount of that you wrote the get, it's still considered le'a poisei. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, even though the get, the actual words of the get don't take the full half a boigan that you have, still the white around the get is considered the gilyon, the arum of this get as part of it. So when you calculate, since it's a half a boigan, you could calculate that whatever they cut, even if they cut afterwards, it was only they cut a half a boigan. So they didn't cut more than what the get is. But when you calculate the get, you calculate not just the letters, you calculate also the white around it. And even more so, the Tzemach Tzedek says, another svara, if you really want to go into it, Tzemach Tzedek throws a svara as what's ktsitsa? Everybody, the ones who say that ktsitsa, even the ones that say that by talosh you also have ktsitsa, it still has to be dumi de mechuber. It means we're machmer and ktsitsa by talosh dumi de mechuber. But what's by mechuber? Mechuber, when you're cutting off a big banana leaf from a tree, but it's still miut from the merubah. There's only one leaf. If you cut down the whole tree and you leave one leaf over there, it's not called ktsitsa. It's something else. You just kill the whole tree. Over here, even if you cut more than what the get is, it's not the same as ktsitsa b'mechuber. So he says, throws a svara, says that's another reason why. And b'chlal, some people are mekel. Some people are b'chlal mekel in this. The ones that hold that this ktsitsa doesn't apply. If it's not mechuber, there's no ktsitsa by talosh. But Lamaisa Tzemach Tzedek is not mekel, not because of this. He gives all this, each part a kula, and then he says, because I have so many reises, they should write a second get based on the first minu, and he explains at length why that should work, and then they should give a get. Teras Gitin and Chidushim Sivkot and Ches says that when the Ramos says that if you cut it after the ksiva, the get is possible, just like the get pashut writes, and just like the Pri Chodesh writes, that he says basically according to those that hold the ktsitsa betalosh is asur, so the get is not possible, the get is batal midiraisa. Elamai, he says the same thing, he says another point, just like the Taz says, the Taz also says this, that you could write on a big piece of paper, we're not geyser, maybe if you're going to write on a big piece of paper, you're going to be incentivized to cut it afterwards. And then in Biurim, he goes into a whole other Biurim, Sivkot and Dalad, he goes into another interesting discussion. From the Lashon of this whole discussion in the Siman, it's mashma, if there's a hefsek between a ksiv and then a sinner, it's also, it's possible, it's batal. But what happens if you do the ktsitsa after the sinner? There's no more hefsek between the ktsitsa and the sinner, between the ksiv and the sinner. Ksiv and the sinner, ktsitsa. So maybe it should be kosher. So he says, no, it's still possible. Why? Being that you had in mind when you wrote it, that you're going to later cut a piece of it, is considered oimed l'ktzitza. And therefore, since it's oimed l'ktzitza, it already has a definition of mechusar ktzitza while you were writing it. And only those that hold that there is no shaila of ktzitza by talosh, according to them, it would be kosher. And he says, the Pnei Yeshua says that it's always possible because there's no krisus, for a whole different category. If you give a piece of paper and you have in mind to cut back a piece of it after Nesine, then there's no krisus, because you didn't give the paper fully. You still own a piece of the paper that you gave to your wife. He says that's still not, he doesn't hold it in the Pnei Yeshua. He says that's not true, and he disagrees in the Pnei Yeshua on this, and he says the maskana, no, only according to those that say that there's an isur ktzitza even by talosh, only according to them will still be a problem here, because when you had in mind before writing that you're going to keep part of it afterwards, it becomes the category of mechusar ktzitza. Now he also brings what I mentioned to you from the Get Pashut, that there's no difference if the husband had in mind to cut it or the sefer had in mind to cut it. He says no, that's not also not accurate. He says that it's what the Get Pashut is saying is not that the two people in the room, it makes no difference who had in mind. It means whoever owns the paper, that's the one who has to have in mind. If the sefer owns the paper and he had in mind to cut afterwards, that's a problem. If the husband owns the paper and he had in mind to cut afterwards, it's also a problem. But it doesn't mean that if you have a get and the husband is sitting over there and he sees the sefer writing on a big piece of paper and he's like, hey, I like this paper, I'm going to cut off a piece afterwards, that it's going to be a problem if he has in mind before the paper is his. And then and therefore he says, this is all in Biurim Sifkatan Hey, that therefore if during the writing you had in mind to cut it, but afterwards you changed your mind and you don't want to cut it and you gave the whole thing b'matana, the get is kosher. That's what he writes over there. He says the owner of the paper had in mind to do it and he changed his mind, it's still kosher. What's interesting from this is, it comes a very interesting diuk. Because if you read the Lashonos of the Shulchan Aruch, it seems to imply that if you write a get on paper and you're going to cut it, especially based on your machshava, it's considered mechusar ktzitza. So the shaila is if the ksiva is also possible or not. From the get pasha, it's mashma, no. The ksiva remains kosher. The psul of ktzitza only kicks in after ksiva is over. So if you had in mind to do ktzitza, so then the psul of ktzitza kicks in. If you didn't have in mind to do the psul of ktzitza doesn't kick in even if you cut it liyapaisei. But if you had in mind to do ktzitza, and then you change your mind, you give the whole thing with matana, before the nesine, so you eliminated the chashash, and the ksiva remains a ksiva. If you look in Kavnaki and say the Getrishin, Sifkot and Samach Gimel, he brings the name of Pachad Yitzchak, that if you, based on this machshava that it's liyapoisa, it's kosher. Yeah, he says, if you cut even a tiny piece of the get, because that's the get that's written on klaf, and there's a long piece of klaf, and the Sefer writes it, and towards the bottom he's like, hey, there's so much space over here, I have to write a tefillin for somebody. If I'm going to cut a strip on the bottom of the get, I'll be able to write a parsha of tefillin. Small parsha. It's possible. Why? Because you have in mind to cut it, and it's not liyapoisei. So it's not about the size. The liyapoisei, the size that the Ramah brings, is only for a specific topic to discuss what's beged liyapoisei. But if you specifically have in mind not liyapoisei, then it's possible. And if you have in mind liyapoisei, then it is kosher. The Ramah then concludes, if you write a get on a sefer, on a book, even though the book has a lot of other things in it, still kosher. This is from the Torah, the name of the Itur. You look in the Prisha, over there on the Torah, and he says that even though it says sefer krisus, we would think sefer echad v'lo harbe sfarim means one story, not many stories. Still in all, it's kosher. That's what the Torah, that Bala Itur is telling us. As long as you give it, the Lavush phrase it a little bit different. He says, we don't care how many stories you have in the book, as long as the get is part of it, B'chlal Mosayim Mana. Now, what does it mean that there's other things in this sefer? Does it mean that it's other pages of the book, or does it mean on the same page you have other things written? So there's a book called Avnei Ha'ephod from Rav Pipano. He was a Rav in Bulgaria, I think. It's a book on Even HaEzer. He wrote two Sfarim. Avnei Ha'ephod is one, and I forgot the name of the second one. One is on Shemus Gitin, and one's a Biur on Hilchas Gitin. And over there on the Biur on Hilchas Gitin, over here in Sifkat Zayin, he says that if there's nothing else written within the nusach of the get, and there's other pages of the book, then it's kosher for sure. But if there's something else mixed in within the nusach of the get, like you wrote 6 lines of the get, then you wrote something else, and you wrote another 6 lines of the get, Suffolk is not sure. This is quoted in Shas Tshuvas Nachlas Ezra of Ezra Hadaya, was a Rav of the Diner Yisrael, and Even HaEzer Siman Yutes, and he says, he brings a raya from a Gemara, that if the other things that are written in the get are also connected to the get, maybe the Sefer the husband wanted some more flowery language and that, was whatever he decided to put in there, it's all minyana shall get, then it's fine. Doesn't change it, then even if it's within the get, it's not a problem. Nachlas Ezra, Even HaEzer Siman Yutes Ois Dalad. But if it's not minyana shall get, for example, he writes over there that that he wants. He told the Eidim, please write a get to my wife and send her regards, and they wrote it inside the get because that's what he told them to write. Then it's a problem, unless it starts with the nusach of the get, then it goes off topic and then goes back to the nusach of the get. But if it starts the nusach of the get and it goes off topic and it does not go back to the get, and the Eidim chasmet on after the non-connection to the get line, then it's possible. That is to finish the topic of Sif Gimel, and I'm going to jump to the end of the Siman in Sif Tes. Sif Tes, it says you cannot give the get to the woman until the ink is completely dry. It says nesina, not to give the get. Why? Because if not, it's considered ksav haroy lizdayef. The Chelkas Mechoykek says that he doesn't understand Bechlal what's the chiddush of ksav haroy lizdayef. Ksav haroy lizdayef, we already know in the beginning of the Siman, give it with Eidem Mesirah. So he says no. The reason is like based on the Mordechai. The Mordechai says that the ink which is not dry it's not bar kayama. Why? Because on klaf you could wipe it off and you'll never know that anything was ever written on it. So there might be a tanai in the get, and the wife is going to receive it when it's wet. She's going to take a baby wipe out the tanai, and the get is kosher without anything else. And it's because then you can't tell that anything was deleted from it. The Pri Chodesh takes this reason, trashes it with one word, says this reason leika. Doesn't hold of it bichlal. The Pri Chodesh. He says leika. This whole svara leika doesn't begin bichlal. Now, if the get was given before it was dried, so the Chelkas Mechoykek doesn't clearly write it, but the Beis Shmuel understands from Chelkas Mechoykek that it's a suffix possible. The Beis Shmuel says Lamaisa we go based on Shas and the Sineh. And if it's wet, you give it with Eidem Mesirah. That's the din of Davar Shechol Yizdayef. The Get Pashut points out in Sifkot Memches that from the Lashon Shulchan Aruch Lo Yitnenu Lo, it's mashma that we only care about it v'shas nesinah. That's when we care if it's dry or not. But the Eidim could sign when it's wet. And he says it doesn't make sense because the Mechaber himself writes over here Yitnenu Lo Yitnenu Lo K'shulach, writes in Siman Kuf Lamed Siv Chav Beis Yesh Mishayim that you have to completely dry the get before the Eidim sign on it. So he says, no, the Ma'aseh Machlokes Rishonim, the Beis Yosef brings a Machlokes Rishonim. And he brings most Rishonim hold that the Eidim could sign when the get is wet. Elamai is a Shidas HaKundreisim that you have to wait till the get is dry. So therefore, over here where he discusses it, he says the halacha. Over there he says, Yesh Mishayim, so try to be machmer on it over there also. Over there, and then Sifkot Memtes, he says, what's the reason for Yachol Yizdayef? Like I just mentioned to you before, he says the same thing as the Beis Shmuel, that he's going to delete a Tanai that's written over there. And then the Get Pasha continues, and he says, and if you sprinkled sand on the ink to make it dry, you have to be machmer, because the ink is mevatel, because the sand is mevatel, the ink that's sitting under it. Just like in tefillin, if you're mefazer afrizov, yeah, it's possible. And if afterwards you scraped off the sand,
why the sand itself not good enough for ink?
we'll get to that soon. So he says tzarichin if it goes back to the kashrus, and therefore he says if you're precious for time, bring the get close to the fire and let it dry from the heat. Pischei Tshuva and Sivkot and Design bring this and brings the get mekusher. It questions this whole logic of him about the offer, and he says it doesn't make a difference anyways. By Sefer Torah it's a special din. By a get it's not so. By a get, as long as the oisius are nikar, it's kosher. Therefore, ladina, if you put offer on the letters, it should be kosher, because you can still tell the letters. And what does it make a difference if the earth? Just add to the logic. If you mixed earth with if you mixed offer sand into your ink, and then you wrote it, will it be possible? It's still not going to be. It's harder to write. What? Why what?
Why am I saying the Torah in the tussle?
So there you have to see the ink. It's a din in the ink. By a get, it's a din in the oisius. And he says, even if you don't scrape it. And the Maisi says, at least scrape it to be at least not to go fully against the get pashat. The Maisi says, whole thing doesn't apply today. Be'etzim, logically it doesn't apply, because you write on paper. On paper, even if it's not dry, you'll never be able to wipe it off, because the ink is liquid and it gets absorbed as reshumay nikar. You'll never be able to delete, you'll never be able to erase it while it's wet without leaving a mark on the paper. What's the main issue today? That if you're going to fold it, today we fold the gitin and we give it to her, she go into her hand. If you fold the get and it's wet, the letters are going to get glued together. You're not able to say what happened. But lemaise, we're still not makel. Why? Based on a bach. The bach, the Shas Tshuvas HaBach, which is mentioned in Pischei Tshuvas of Katan Yud Zayin, that as long as the get is not completely dry, now remember, the Bach is the one that said that in the Salonikin and Mitzrayim he wrote Gittin on paper, so he knew this. He still writes that a get which has ink which is not fully dry has the geder is nikra davar sheyachol lizdayef. The Lashon Shulchan Aruch is nikra davar sheyachol lizdayef. The Lashon Torah. It's not that it's mamish yachol lizdayef. It goes into that category. And if it goes into that category, you're going to go into the category of Edom Mesirah. Chachamim did not make a differentiation, the Poskim did not make a differentiation between something, whether it's fully Yachol Lizdayef, partially Yachol Lizdayef. The moment something is in the category of Yachol Lizdayef, you have to be machmer. So therefore, even though today, when it comes to paper, you don't have really this chashash, still no. We still do it sai practical for the folding, and sai because we don't want to go against the Bach that says that when it's not fully dry, it's still begeder of ksav sheyachol lizdayef. With that we conclude the shiur on Siman Kuf Chav Gimel. Next year will be in Siman Kuf Chav Daled. Kuf Chav Daled, next year will be Siman Kuf Chav Hey.